Welcome to the Dr. Wyatt Show podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Wyatt Fisher, a licensed psychologist specializing in couples counseling. If you want to improve your communication for more love and less conflicts, I have an app for that. Download Keep the Glow wherever you get your apps and start with 2 weeks free. Well, today we have a special guest with us. We have Dr. Corey Allen, who is a marriage and family therapist. He has a PhD in family therapy. He's been in private practice for 20 years, podcasting for 11 years, and married almost 30 years. So he's bringing a wealth of experience, knowledge. And so I think you're going to really appreciate what we have to talk about today. He's going to get into this whole topic that sex is a language. So thanks, Corey, for being on the podcast today.
Oh, yeah, this will be fun.
Yeah. So before we jump into sex as a language, if you could share a little more about your backstory, what got you into the mental health field, and whatever you want to share with the audience.
Well, so this is a truly family of origin journey for me. I went to undergrad for youth and family ministry with the idea I would then transition at some point out of that, because youth ministry is one of those short shelf life for what the way churches normally do it. The youngest guy is the one doing it. And then as you get older, it's a rarity that somebody's still in there that's older. So I just figured an easy transition from there would be family work, therapy work, etc. Plus my father teaches sociology and psychology at a professor at a college he did for 41 years at least. And my sister's a social worker. And then the joke in my family is my mom's crazy. So, because it kind of fits the whole thing. And we use that jokingly, but she does battle anxiety and depression and now has dementia, early stages. She's gotten aged older into the almost 80s. So, but it's just, it was what I was raised around. I was raised around systems, and I was raised around this kind of work. And it just made sense. I had a little stint in the business world after I left the ministry before I went back to school and realized that's not my wiring. So, this fits perfectly, and I love what I do and can do it for the rest of my life. That's the other thing too.
Yeah. Super. Okay. So sex is a language. What makes you interested in this topic to begin with?
Well, I think that everything we do in marriage communicates something. Everything we do in every relationship communicates all the time. For any English majors listening, they're going to hate this, but you cannot not communicate. So it's the idea of, when you look at how I enter my house, how I position myself when I have a conversation with somebody, everything is communicating something. Even stuff I don't say or don't do communicates something. If I have a habit of greeting my wife when she comes home, and one day she doesn't get a greet when she comes home, I've communicated something, and it can either be intentionally negative and cruel, or it could just be an oversight, or it could just be I'm busy doing something else, or it could just be she surprised me when she came home. There's a lot of things, but I think if you can look at it in that framework, then you can start to look at our sex lives as the same thing. That how we do sex is also how we do life, and how we do life is how we do sex. I think those are interchangeable. And a lot of that's my training in the therapy world with Dr. Schnarch. He believed that sex was an elicitation window with clients, that if they described what they do and how, it tells you how they live. And
interesting.
That's true. Yeah. And so if you look at your own life that way, like if your audience or you and I, we look at our own lives and our sex lives, there's a lot of similarities in what I do and the intimate moments sexually with my wife are kind of what I do in life, on how I approach it. Typically one's more clothed than the other,
Yeah, hopefully.
Let's keep that out there. But it's seeing it as there's a dynamic and a language that's being unfolding there.
Yeah.
And when you can look at it that way, I think we can start to change. All right. Rather than me complaining about whatever it is I'm not getting, how do I look at what is present and address it that way instead?
So what would be a concise definition of sex as a language?
That I think we're always communicating something, whether it's sexual or not. And when I look at that aspect of my life and that aspect of my marriage, how am I communicating? And am I communicating cleanly and clearly with what I vocally say too? Because this is the classic one, or there's several, but the ones that come to my mind are normal marital sex has problems and difficulties that'll happen. Every couple will face it or has faced it or is facing it. It's just an inevitability. But let's say you came into a marriage and you've got premature ejaculation issues. But yet what you keep saying, because your wife is hurt by this, because it makes it over way too fast, and it's not just about you. And if you're a typical male in a lot of ways, where once you've ejaculated, then you're done, she's leaving a lot of, and not all of them, unfulfilled. So it's recognizing if he's saying, yeah, I'm going to get that looked at, I'm going to do some research, but he doesn't. Well, there's an incongruence of the language there.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can start to look at it of sex as a language, if I say it's important to me, are my actions showing that too?
Okay. So it's
if
more about kind of
care about this, do my actions show that too?
Yeah.
Right? So if you can just boil it down, you can start to examine you and your spouse's dynamic differently, but more importantly, your own dynamic differently.
Sure. So you mentioned most marriages, or a lot of marriages, have problems in the bedroom. From your experience, what do you think are some of those common causes for those problems?
The biggest ones that come up are, one of them is naivete and ignorance of just what's supposed to be going on and what does this mean, and anxiety and everything. Because as soon as you get any kind of a difficulty, whether it's an inability to achieve orgasm, or non-arousal, or I can't lubricate as a female, or I can't get an erection, or I lost it, now all of a sudden that's ingrained, and now my anxiety has enhanced even more of what do I do when this happens again, or it was painful one time, now what do I do when it's painful,
Like a vicious cycle.
Right. And so it becomes a psychological component as well as a physical. That's one, just because I think a lot of us come into our sex lives and our sexuality with a lot of misinformation and no information, which is the benefit of our shows and other things that are finally helping in some ways better get it out there. The other ones are aging issues that come up just because things change and evolve, and it's a little more difficulty for arousal or maintaining or lubrication. It's just libidos shift, and then seasons happen when you have kids, you have financial stressors, or you have a pandemic, which that's wreaked a lot of havoc on a lot of couples' lives, not just emotionally, but sexually too.
Sure.
There was the going in when the whole pandemic started. I was even wrongly on the side of wondering, would this enhance relationships because you're gonna have more time together,
right?
Because what we could equate that to was like wartime, where everybody was really grasping each other because there was a lot of uncertainty for life. But when it was a invisible killer, it's a whole different anxiety.
Sure.
So it didn't necessarily enhance connection for people.
Right. Yeah. And under the pandemic, people couldn't sweep their issues under the rug anymore because they're with their partner 24/7. So all those hidden resentments and problems got surfaced, which raised the divorce rate. I read during that pandemic, and that was partially the reason, right? When you were saying that, some people have negative experiences sexually in the bedroom with their partner, and then that psychologically creates more issues, that vicious cycle. It reminded me of a couple I worked with one time, and the woman was the higher drive, the higher libido partner. And I remember they told me this story where they'd be having intimacy, and the woman, if she knew her husband was about ready to climax, she would say, no, 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 no. And she would get really upset.
Right.
And this poor guy, it created so much pressure and anxiety in him that he then started experiencing erectile dysfunction. And just because he was so worried that then he wasn't going to be able to perform and satisfy his wife. And so it just made me think of that story.
Yeah, because, that's a great descriptor of a language, because what's going on is happening simultaneously of, we're reading each other as well as trying to be aware and perceptive of ourselves. And one of those typically wins out over the other as things unfold. Sometimes we can shift it back to where it's more about it's really hard to do simultaneously, to read your partner as not having a good time and then still enjoy yourself.
Sure.
Or read your partner as having a great time, which then enhances your time, which increases the intensity, which shortens the time. So it's just because you could have gone into that interlude wanting a long, drawn out occasion, and then all of a sudden, man, they really got into it, which meant you got to climax a whole lot faster than you were hoping, which made it a disappointment for you, and it's just all of that is normal. If you can look at it as this is just a language, and if I can start to examine how am I more able to adjust and go with the flow. With our show and with my work, we use the idea that great sex is defined by two people that recover well, period. Because it doesn't always go seamlessly, but can you recover and reconnect and get going again? Because I think then you recognize your capacity, what you can become and who you are and what you're capable of.
Sure. Yeah, it reminds me of this analogy I've heard before that I really appreciate, which is 2 eyes in, 2 eyes out, or 1 eye in, 1 eye out. And what that means, and it's applicable to the bedroom too. So the partner who's 2 eyes in, they're just preoccupied with their experience sexually and what's happening for them. And that could be positive things happening for them or negative things happening for them, but they lose track of their partner because they're too self-focused.
Yep.
Others of us are 2 eyes out, where during sexual contact, we're only thinking of our partner, only thinking of what they need, their experience, and we lose ourselves.
Yep.
And so that balance for all of us, no matter which way you lean, is how do I become more 1 eye in, where I am mindful of me and my experience and what I need, while I'm also tracking you and what you need and what adjustments you would appreciate.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think of that type of analogy in the bedroom?
No, I think that fits perfectly. We use a similar expression in the sense that great sex also incorporates what I want as well as what my partner wants. That we're both going after what we want and what each other wants.
Sure.
And there's a dance there. There's a fluidity there. There's a follow the connection there. There's a willingness to speak up and alter and adjust. Hopefully not at the point of climax like your couple you described.
Right.
No, wait. Hopefully figure out a way to get ahead of that before.
Sure.
Point of no return for men. But it's just seeing it as I think there's just a element of we all exist within a framework of myself and my togetherness idea. And I need to learn how to move back and forth in there.
Yeah.
Well, right. Because there's times where it does need to wait. I just need to kind of relax and connect with you here. Or wait. I need to kind of get in tune with me here.
Sure.
And if I can bring that to the forefront more, I think I have a chance to have more collaboration with my spouse.
So what would you recommend to the partner who's listening to this and they're thinking, I really don't care about sex. I could care less if I ever have sex again. I'm low desire and I don't feel really connected to my partner anyway. So why would I want to have sex? What would you say to those partners struggling with that?
Well, there's a whole lot of caveats in what you just set up, because the low desire doesn't necessarily mean no desire. Sometimes the low desire just means slow to respond desire. Sure. But they actually can get into it. And when they do, it's really enjoyable. And that's distinguishing them differently than those that I could write this off completely because it's just not worth the hassle.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So to the former, which is that I can get into it, but yet it's just not on the forefront of my mind.
Yeah.
Which doesn't compute to a higher desire a lot of times, because they're like, you enjoy this. How does this not always on your mind? Because it's on his mind or her mind all the time.
Right.
Because they enjoy it. They equate pleasure in a different hierarchy in their own life. Then it just becomes recognizing, okay, how do I respond to cues better? How do I create room for the potential? I don't necessarily have to seek it. I don't have to be the one that leads it necessarily, which turns into a whole different complicated language there, where the hires are like, I'm done initiating till you initiate next. And that's usually a recipe for disaster in the long run. But if they can recognize this is important and have a collaboration with their higher desire to realize the higher desire job in some ways is to keep it on the forefront and do some of the effort to get it the possibilities to see if it happens.
Okay.
But if it's a spouse that has the no, I want to write it off, I don't care at all, well, then you got a dilemma of how do you do this relationally? Because you have now changed the dynamic of the relationship. And in my mind, that can be weaponized, or it can be seen as a problem we need to address. And a lot of times there are people that I work with that have weaponized it. They are withholding, knowingly wanting certain conditions to be met in behaviors by their partner before they would, rather than look at it as, wait, this is an integrated part of your being. And if you want to not address that, then you need to at least be honest to your spouse so they can make a decision accordingly. And I don't recommend relationships ending, but I do realize it's a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have to get to these critical mass moments to see what really do people hold dear.
Yeah.
Do they really value what really is important in their relationship?
Mm-hmm.
So they can make decisions accordingly. And again, to be clear, if people aren't familiar with my work and the way I think of this, that's not something I should be afraid of, because that's typically many, many, many steps down the road. But I got to be willing to take steps towards to see how does that pressure play itself out.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like one transition that can help is helping the lower desire or no desire partner realize or recognize or buy into the value of sexual intimacy for the marriage, not necessarily for either partner's needs, even though needs are also valid, but kind of shifting it away from individual needs and more toward marriage needs.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on helping couples or helping lower desire partners buy into this idea that sexual intimacy is healthy for the marriage?
Oh, I completely agree. It is, because it creates a whole different type of knowing and being known that we don't get everywhere else. Hopefully, this is the one place, if you're in a monogamous relationship, that occurs, which I am pro marriage and pro monogamy. That's the work I do. But this is just where it becomes a complicated thing to talk about on a podcast.
Sure.
Because people hear it in a certain way and then run with it, that it's like, well, that was in the message, but that's not what I'm saying, right? Because that's what we do as people. We get sound bites, if you will, that fit our script. But if I'm dealing with a couple, let's say, I've got a couple of these right now where sex is the issue, and it's no and yes, right? One wants it, one doesn't. And it's just, if the one that doesn't want it is adamant enough to say, I'm not doing anything towards it, even if I couch it as, and I have, it's a relational dynamic. It is a component of the relationship. It is an agreed upon thing. There's an undercurrent of this was a set thing that would happen. Not all the time necessarily, but it's there. So if you want to hold to that so strongly that you won't, that means you're willing to let them go. And that's the way I frame it. I don't try to convince somebody to have sex that doesn't want to have sex.
Yeah.
But I want them to have to face the consequences of their decision. Because too often we want to make a decision and not face the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I use this hypothetical, so let's, this would work, I guess. So Pam and I are celebrating 30 years in May as we're recording this. And if she was to say on her anniversary, you know what, 30 years of sex with you is enough. I'm done. I don't ever want to have sex again, and I don't want you to leave. Right? So she can make the first call. She can't make the second one.
Mm-hmm.
But if she can steal my choice of I can't leave, it makes it easier for her to make the first one. Those are the two choice dilemmas that we have in life. And you can always boil things down to two choice dilemmas. Wyatt, I want to tell you what I think, but I don't want you to be mad.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't get to tell you can't be mad.
Yeah. You can't control the other person's reaction.
But we try to, because it makes it easier for me to do what it is I want to do, or what I'm wrestling with, or what I don't want to do. And so I think when we can frame them as the way Schnarch would refer to these, as he refers to them as crucibles, that I could get locked in my own crucible of, I have to choose this or this. That's it. I don't get the choice of how you're going to react or respond to that. Then hopefully, and most of the time, creates enough impetus for me to have to really examine, wait, is this a relational thing that could be beneficial? Okay, maybe it could, maybe it's not. All right. Now all of a sudden, because a lot of times in those instances, the no desire partner has a past with sex that is not pretty.
Yeah.
And so they've got to do some work. And a lot of us don't want to do that work. And I understand that. I don't want to do that work. with the things that have been traumatic and troublesome in my past either. I don't want to look back at those things.
Yeah.
To truly grow and become who I can be, I got to.
Sure. Yeah. And it's very similar to other needs, right? So we're talking about the sexual need. And if your partner is saying, nope, never going to have sex with you again, that's could be considered neglect. Just like if someone else is saying, you need emotional intimacy, sorry, I'm never going to provide that.
Yeah.
So that's also neglect. And so these areas of neglect, people often don't realize neglect is under the umbrella of abuse. And so if you're in a relationship and you keep bringing up your needs, whether it's for emotional intimacy or affection or sexual intimacy, and it falls on deaf ears, your partner refuses to work on it, I encourage couples, the next round is you see a therapist or a coach for 3 to 6 months. Hopefully that will unearth why there is such resistance and what's happening. And there might be resentments that need to be resolved, or the friendship might need to get fostered further before there's breakthroughs. But then after that 3 to 6 months, if there's still a refusal to work on that need to take some steps, then I recommend a separation for couples as a wake up call. Because so many people do fall asleep in marriage, long-term marriages, and at that point, if you're staying with your partner still at that point, then you're actually enabling them to neglect you and to not meet your needs.
Yeah, I get it. And I think of this, I mean, we're kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
I think of it in terms of if I'm in a relationship where my spouse has said, I'm not interested in sex with you, or I refuse to meet your emotional level in depth, or whatever it might be, that it's so easy for us to make it all about them. What's wrong with them, right? That's where the typical higher desire, lower desire comes to see me, under the belief that the lower desire is the problem. Right. So they need to be fixed. If they could just get their stuff taken care of, everything will be fine. Rather than, wait, what about the fact that what it is I'm wanting, how could I be colluding to make it to where it's not worth wanting?
Right.
Because I go at emotional connection desperately, which that most of the time is pushed away just by reaction in our brains, right? If I have a kid, when I come home or they come home and they're in a very, very needy stance, I don't want to go and comfort them immediately, because it's like, good gracious, this is icky feeling. And it's the same. I feel icky too when I'm in those moments.
Yeah.
Why would somebody help me out? But if I can recognize, wait, I am really in a bad spot. And sometimes I go desperate to try to get this need met. And instead I realize, wait, it's better if I own that, of like, I'm just in a really down spot and I'd love to have some time to hang out with you.
Yeah.
Maybe we talk, maybe we have sex, maybe there's an emotional connection, maybe not, but it's still, that's me moving into it a little more open and owning my side, which I think then puts better pressure on the partner that's refusing or doesn't want to face whatever is, or, kind of what you're describing. And that allows the time to see it as, I'm owning me well enough to know I can make the choices I need to in the long run without crumbling.
Yeah.
Because too often we make these moves, these pseudo moves early in hopes it'll create the whole system change. But when it really becomes pressurized, I crumble.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's easy to move down that pressure road. Yeah. And what I see a lot with couples is, in the beginning, there's lots of sex, lots of courting is going on, lots of emotional intimacy. So there's also a lot of sex. But then if you're together for a while, the high libido partner stops the courting, but still expects the sex. And then that's where you get into those issues. And so, I love ownership and taking ownership and seeing what your part is, because that's a great question for all high libido partners listening right now, is what are you doing, if anything, that might be contributing to your partner not be interested in sex?
Right. Because you're doing something,
most likely.
Even if it's just like 2%, there's still 2% there. So you can take care of, you can do 100% of that 2% better.
Sure. Yeah. And then that gives you something that you can control. Because if you're high libido, it often can feel out of control, that your partner holds all the power. They decide if and when there's going to be intimacy. So to bring it back to like, wait a minute, what am I contributing here? And how am I making this worse?
Right. Which to be fair, I believe the lower desire partner when it comes to sex is the de facto gatekeeper. Whether they like it or not, they are.
Sure. And that's why they hold all the power. Right. And then that can feel really powerless if you're high libido. And so then focusing on, wait a minute, how am I making this worse? What's my contribution? What's the part I can own? That actually brings back a sense of control, because then you can know, well, if I work on X, Y, and Z, that's going to optimize our chances for more connection.
Right. And so let's pivot this
on.
back to what we started with the sex as a language, because this just came to my mind. So the higher desire spouse, and let's make up the male, just for the sake of our conversation, because it can happen both sides. It's usually 20 to 30% women that I come across that are the higher desire spouses.
Yep.
But for the male, he gets caught in, okay, but I can make this about her. I do enjoy, I love pleasing her. But a lot of what happens is the higher desire has not done the real work underneath it all to realize I love pleasuring her the way I want to pleasure her, not the way she wants to be pleasured.
Sure.
That's my growth gap right there. But I'm happy to give. I'm generous. And but I'm generous on my terms and my descriptions. What's generosity to her? How have I learned her language? How have I learned her, what it is that speaks to her in those ways?
Sure.
Right?
And
because
that other growth.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah. And the other growth gap, I think, piggybacking off of that is am I nurturing the warmth and the connection emotionally outside of the bedroom?
Absolutely. I think that'd be a component of it, because you start to recognize. I mean, I recognize this in my marriage after 7 to 10 years in. I'm sorry, I was a slow learner at this point. Apparently.
It's hard.
My affectionate touch level was only present when when I was interested in sex.
Sure.
It wasn't an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
Except for the gropes and the butt slaps and those things, which is still kind of like, that's not necessarily a turn on.
Yeah.
I'll walk by, grab a breast, typically doesn't make a woman lubricate.
No, you just turn off.
Right. It's like, okay, so I needed to learn, if I'm an affectionate person, how am I expressing that without an attachment to an outcome, without it being something that needs to be culminating right away, because we believe sex and marriage is a long game.
Sure.
Right. The moves I make, the statements I make, the presence I am is setting up an ongoing thing, not just I hope I get lucky tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really comes down to both partners need to do their part, to have a healthy, connected, emotional and sexual relationship. Both high and low libido partners play a part in that. And so it needs to make sure it's not just focused on one partner needs to do the work or the other partner needs to do the work. And if both partners can see, like, what are my steps? If I'm low libido, what steps do I need to be taking to make myself more open to sexual connection? And if I'm high libido, what steps do I need to be taking to nurture the relationship, the broader context, so my partner's more open to sexual connection?
And I think a lot of that's just a conversation of recognizing, you know what, I've expected you to carry a great deal of this process, honey, and I need to be better at either trying to meet you earlier or being honest about it. Because my wife and I've gotten to the language where it's like, hey, coming after you tonight. I'll just make it. I don't ask a question anymore. I announce an intention, because I have found if you ask a lower desire partner a question that has a yes or a no answer, you know what you're getting. Because in that moment, it's likely a no. Because as we're recording this, it's tax season. Sex is nowhere on my wife's mind because she's a CPA.
Yeah.
She is in the throes of that right now.
Sure.
So when I announce, hey, carve some time out, I'd love to connect. Right. I don't know if it'll happen or not, but I'm at least kind of entering into. And what's great is she can then realize, okay, it's going to take me a while to get there. So you're going to have some energy to help me. And if she's honest about that, I got that kind of energy, or I don't have that kind of energy to get you warmed up. So no, we'll wait. Right. But too often the language becomes this expectation. Of, I get in bed with you. You get me going, then I can enjoy it. And then in that case, it's still really just all about the one partner. It's not about both. But if I can bring myself to it better, I have a whole different language where we're now talking and living, which is a whole lot more energy typically.
Sure. So what would be a final tip that you would like to leave the listeners on love or sex as a language and how to enhance their sexual relationship?
The best thing is just making sure you are in congruence with your integrity and character in this aspect of your marriage and your life. That if I say it's important to me, am I living it as such? Because most often we get caught up in the scenario of, well, I've just had too many rejections. I've had too many advances made. I changed that to, wait, if you choose to no longer express interest or affection, but you claim you are an affectionate person, you are attached to an outcome. So if you're an affectionate person, be affectionate. Be careful in how you do it, but realize if you choose to no longer do it because you've been rejected so many times, you're already in a state of rejection. So what's cleaner for your character to move into, which a lot of times I think that means, well, if I'm a talker, I talk. If I'm a toucher, I touch. I just need to be cleaner and better about how am I a student of my partner and what will land with them too.
Yeah, that's interesting because it really shows how conditioning in a marriage over time, if there is negative reactions to how we're wired, we do tend to get conditioned to shut that part of us down.
Yeah.
And then we can feel like we're living in a straitjacket and not really being true to who we are.
We take something that was said years and years ago as indefinitely truth, rather than that's where they were at that moment. That's not necessarily who they are now, because we all have software iterations, if you will, of our being. So sometimes I get caught up operating in my mind as Pam 1.0 is who I'm married to. But no, I'm probably at Pam 5.0 right now, more accurately.
Great. So if the listeners wanted to follow up with you or learn more about you, Corey, what would be the best way?
So passionatelymarried.net is my online home. Everything I do is there with video courses, the over 600 podcasts we've got. Find me if you want to work with me, because I work with people online with coaching for marriage and individual issues, run groups, have just a whole wealth of information there. So passionatelymarried.net, you can find me.
Super. All right. Well, thanks again for being a guest on the podcast.
Absolutely. It's been fun. Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Wyatt Show podcast. And remember, your marriage is alive. If you care for it and nurture it, it will grow. If you deprive it and neglect it, it will wilt and die. The choice is up to you. Take care.